Star Trek The Next Generation, Starfleet Academy, Worf's First Adventure, Chapter 11. Worf checked the neutron flow along the graviton field and nodded in approval. On the one hand, this was a fairly boring procedure. On the other hand, at least it was going smoothly. If there had been a variation in the field of even 1 percentage point from the norm, then Worf might have had to spend hours trying to track down the source. But the measurements were precisely where they were supposed to be. Worf slid the wall panel shut and turned as Salida came over to him.
"All is well?"
he asked. She nodded. "The coils are sound. Structural integrity is still solid. I have not found anything to indicate any potential breakdowns in the station's efficiency or long-term—" "Worf!" It was Simon's voice. Worf looked around, momentarily confused, and then he realized that his brother's voice was coming over the communications link. Simon had been assigned to inspect the long-range monitor redundancies on Level 1. Worf tapped the comlink in response.
"Yes, Simon."
"Worf, get up here. I want your opinion on something. Fast!" Worf and Salida glanced at each other.
"If there's a problem,"
began Worf. "I'm not sure. I want someone double-checking these readings. Worf, I'm not kidding. Get up here."
"I will bring Salida," said Worf.
Fine, just move." Without further discussion, Worf and Salida ran down the corridor. They took the turbo lift up 3 levels and emerged on a Level 1. Simon was standing there waiting for them. "Come on," he said. They hurried after him and arrived at the detection center to discover Zach Keebran standing there going over some instrumentation. He looked up at the others. "Where'd you disappear to?" demanded Zach of Simon. Simon didn't bother to answer him, but instead turned to Worf and Salida.
"Check over subroutine System A, long range. Tell me what you see."
"I'll tell you what I see," began Zach. Worf cut him off, stepping up to the control panel.
"No one asked you," he snapped.
Salida stood next to him, watching as his large hands moved quickly over the display. Worf's face creased in a frown.
"There is a blip,"
Worf said finally.
"Some sort of electron flux."
"An intruder?" Salida asked. Worf shook his head.
"It is not being picked up on any of the primary detectors."
"Do we tell Clark?" said Simon. "Tell him what?" snarled Zach. "There can't be an intruder. If there were, the primary detection fields would have reported it. This place would be ringing with enough alarms to be heard halfway to Argelius. There can't be an intruder that's only being picked up by a third-level redundancy." He paused. "Maybe it's a spatial distortion flux."
"Get McHenry up here," said Worf. "No one knows spatial distortions like he does."
"The man is a spatial distortion," sniffed Zach. Right, McHenry." Simon had sounded momentarily confused, as if he hadn't quite connected with the situation yet. He tapped his comm badge. "McHenry!" No answer. "McHenry!" he said again. Still no answer. The others looked worriedly at each other. "Mark, where the blazes are you?" snapped Simon. "Right here." They jumped as they turned. Mark McHenry was standing directly behind them, as if he'd materialized out of thin air. "I was in between this level and the next one, climbing through a Jeffries tube," said Mark. "When you called, I just climbed the rest of the way up."
"We're picking up something on long-range scanners, but only through a third-level check system. Primary scanners aren't picking up anything. We think maybe it's being fooled by a spatial distortion flux."
"Either that or maybe it's broken," offered Mark. "We've run a primary check," said Salida. "The system reads normal." Mark shrugged. "Maybe what's broken is the check systems." "Maybe we should get Tanya up here," said Simon. "She's the engineering expert." "Why don't we just have everybody up here?" said Zach with a snort, "and make a party out of it." "No, it's okay," said Mark. He moved to a console. "I got a knack for this kind of stuff. This is the primary detection station, right?"
"Yeah, right,"
said Simon. "And if we were really in danger, there'd be alarms, right?"
"Right,"
Worf said. He was starting to get impatient. But since we're not, Mark continued, as if striving mightily to understand, it means either that there's no danger, or else this thing here is broken. Right, Salida now said. Even the Vulcan girl seemed a bit put off by Mark's denseness. Mark studied the console carefully, looking under it and around it. This is a waste of time, muttered Zack. And then slowly, carefully, Mark drew back a hand, curled his fingers under, and punched the console. Immediately, a massive thumping alarm went off that sounded throughout the station. The cadets looked at one another in momentary confusion, all except Mark McHenry, who was remarkably calm. Fixed it, said Mark. Commander Clark's voice crackled over all of their comm badges at the same time. What the devil's going on up there? He demanded from the command corps that ran down the middle of the station. Instrumentation was flashing all around them. Readings were flooding in from every sensor device on board the station. Worf waited a moment for Simon to respond. He was the one who had been assigned command of this particular level. Consequently, it was his responsibility to reply to Clark. But Simon just stood there, all the color draining from his face.
Commander, this is Worf, the Klingon said quickly. Instrumentation indicates we have a level 1 intrusion. A ship classified as belonging to a hostile species is within our defense perimeter.
Identify, said Clark. Salida was already on it. She studied the readings and called out, Configuration indicates a Romulan vessel closing fast. I'm alerting Starfleet, said Clark. Keep feeding me readings. Clark to level 5. Prepare defensive weaponry. Maybe they're after Worf, Zack said darkly. They found out they missed one on Kittimer. Worf's head snapped around.
How do you know about Kittimer?
He demanded. Zack looked away, not responding. They're not cloaked, yelled Mark. All of the vague mannerisms had vanished as the emergency had presented itself. Why aren't they cloaked? Logically, said Salida with amazing calm, they decloak when they are preparing to... Prometheus Station rocked around them, knocking all of them off their feet. Worf crashed to the ground, Salida tumbling down atop him. Over the explosions and shouts, they heard Clark yelling over the comm units, telling them not to panic, telling them to do their jobs. On level 5, Briggs and Tanya had fired up the defensive array. They'd brought the shields online and were charging up the phaser battery, but Briggs was fighting down panic. Look at this stuff, he was growling. This stuff is ancient. We'd have better luck crawling outside and throwing bricks at them. Then the Romulan warbird fired. They staggered. Tanya grabbed the underside of a console and barely managed to keep her footing, but Briggs went down. Shields at 73%, she shouted.
Fire!
Clark was bellowing over their comm links.
Fire!
Briggs had struck his head when he fell. Now he lay on the floor unconscious, fighting down the bleak thought of first mission in space, and now I'm going to die here. Tanya scanned the weapons array. For a fleeting moment, she thought she had the warbird targeted, and then she lost it. But she had to make an immediate response, or they were all dead. She hit the firing buttons without a target lock, taking her best guess and tossing off a quick prayer. The phasers blasted out from Prometheus. Tanya hoped that the instruments would tell her that the attacker was little more than floating shards of metal. But instead, her reply was to feel the space station shudder once more under the impact of the Romulan plasma cannons. Her horrified gaze rested upon the latest readouts. The shield strength was down to 23%. Even modern deflectors couldn't take a pounding forever, and the shields of Prometheus were far from the latest tech. She hit her comlink. Tobias to everyone, she called out. Shield's failing. 1 or 2 more hits and they'll collapse. I'm trying to return fire, but I'm all alone down here. Then they were hit again, and that was when she heard the scream. They all heard it through their open comm links, the scream that echoed from the command core. It was Clark's voice, and they also heard over their comm links the sound of something crashing down, cutting off the scream before it had quite reached full voice. On level 1, the cadets looked at one another, ashen. They all knew what that sound meant. Clark's dead, whispered Simon, And then the station was hit again. Consoles overloaded and blew out, and huge chunks of the ceiling began to rain down. Worf yanked Salida out of the way just in time as debris crashed down on the spot where she'd been standing. On their comlinks, they heard Tanya's alarmed shriek. "Shield's failing! Phaser batteries overheating!" "Clark's dead," Simon was saying again. There was no color in his face at all. "He's dead! We're all dead!" The floor started to buckle under them.
"Come on!"
shouted Worf, and he charged for the door. It didn't open. The systems were down. Simon was hysterical. Tears rolled down his face, and he was screaming, "We're trapped! We're trapped!" "Shut up!" shouted Mark.
"Zach, now!"
Worf called to the Brickar, who immediately understood. He ran full tilt, slamming his massive, rock-hard shoulder into the door. The impact was enough to bend it ever so slightly, and Worf was able to work his fingers into the space. He grunted, pulling with all his strength, and now Zach joined him. For seconds, it seemed an eternity, nothing happened. Then all at once, the door ripped right out of the frame.
"Go! Everybody out!"
shouted Worf. All around them, the shattered machinery was starting to flare up, fire eating away at the ancient paneling. Simon didn't move. "There's nowhere to go," he was sobbing. "There's nowhere to go." Worf grabbed Simon by the shoulders.
"We are still alive,"
he grated.
"We quit when we are dead, not before."
The other cadets were already out, and Worf practically lifted Simon off his feet and hurled him out of the room. Worf leapt out after him, and then the entire ceiling caved in. The cadets charged down the hallway. "Where are we going?" shouted Mark. "Tobias, to anyone, please respond!" Tanya's voice crackled over their comlinks.
"All cadets, meet us in the shuttle bay," called Worf. "It is our only chance."
The doors to the turbolift shaft hung open, with no turbolift in sight. Smoke was pouring out of it. The cadets, with Zach in the lead, skidded to a halt in front of it.
"The emergency walkways," called Worf. "If we can get down to—"
Prometheus Station was hit again, and the wall at the far end of the corridor blew out. The station angled sharply, sending the cadets tumbling, and Zach Keeburn, knocked off his feet, fell straight into the open turbo shaft. He reached out desperately, his arms flapping about. At the last second, his 3 fingers curled around the lip of the entrance. He dangled there by one hand, smoke billowing around him. Even through his thick skin, he felt the heat searing him. His small eyes watered. 5 levels below him, an inferno was raging at the bottom of the shaft. The metal he was clutching abruptly bent and started to break, and then a firm hand snagged round his wrist.
"I have you!"
Worf shouted down to him. He was holding on to Zach with one hand. With the other, he was clutching the doorframe. Salida was on her stomach, reaching down and shouting, "Your other hand! Give me your other hand!" Without thinking, Zach reached up and grabbed Salida's outstretched arm. It was only then that a flash of alarm went through his mind. What if he wound up dragging them both down in the shaft with him? But the Vulcan science technician also had the formidable strength of a young Klingon, and she absorbed the pull on her arms without the slightest flinch. Zach's feet pinwheeled desperately, and he managed to find enough of a toehold to help propel himself upward. In a second, Worf and Salida had pulled Keeburn up into safety. There was no time for conversation.
"Quickly," said Worf. "We must get to the—"
It was too late. They heard a sound like a death knell, the world being ripped apart around them. Worf saw Simon collapse, sobbing and clutching at his knees, pulling into a fetal position. Then, in a searing flash of light and a blast of deafening sound, the Prometheus station was swallowed in the fire that its mythological namesake had brought to mankind. Worf lost his footing, not surprising because abruptly the floor was gone. The rending of metal and the death screams of the satellite itself drowned out everything else. Flame leapt up all around them, blocking every possible escape. And then, above the ear-shattering cacophony, Worf called out final words of defiance.
"I go to join my Klingon parents," he shouted. "Cadets, I salute you. It is a good day to die."
And then the heat was gone, as was the station, and the cadets were hurled into the vast, airless, freezing vacuum of space. And as they floated helplessly, waiting for death to claim them, they saw in the cold depths Commander Clark, and he was standing perfectly still and smiling and waving. Chapter 12. Computer and program. 3 words spoken that they should not have been able to hear. But there were the words spoken by presumed dead Commander Clark in his calm, no-nonsense voice. In space, and the shattered remains of the ill-fated Prometheus station all vanished. The cadets, all 12 of them, found themselves lying on a floor. The room they were in was vast and solid black with a crisscrossing yellow grid all around. The only solid object there, aside from themselves, was the shuttlecraft they had traveled into.
Where are we?
Asked Worf in confusion. But it was Mark McHenry who understood immediately. A hollow parlor, he said in amazement. We're in a hollow parlor on Earth, Clark finished for him. He slowly surveyed the amazed stares of the cadets. You never left Earth. The shuttle was specially designed for hollow illusions in the windows to simulate departure. The top of this training center is a retractable roof. Actually, we landed in this holodeck and have been here the entire time.
Training center?
Said Worf. Training center, confirmed Clark. Learning theories of how to deal with difficult, even terminal situations is all well and good, but there's nothing like solid, practical experience. Simon had gotten to his feet. His breath sounded ragged in his chest. Experience? Of course, said Clark. Throughout your career, you... Experience! With a roar, Simon lunged at Clark. Clark took a surprised step back, and Simon would have been at his throat if Worf hadn't caught him and held him back.
Simon, calm down, he said. It was a test. We are all right.
Slowly, Simon brought himself under control. Gradually, he looked around and saw the eyes of the other cadets upon him. He straightened up, smoothed out his jacket, and then he said, Computer, exit. A door appeared at one end of the room. Without a word, Simon left.
Do not go, Worf said. Please.
Simon was packing the last of his things. He stood there in civilian clothes, his cadet uniforms hanging neatly in the closet. He glanced up at Worf and smiled. For the first time in a long time, he smiled, the genuine, warm Simon smile of old. It's done, Worf, he said. I'm done.
We can speak to someone, Worf told him. So you did poorly this time. You can still...
Worf, don't you understand? Don't you get it yet? This is a relief. I'm not cut out for Starfleet. I know that now.
Nonsense, Worf said fiercely. You can do whatever you want to do.
Perhaps, but I don't want to do this. He sat on the edge of his bed a moment, staring at his packed bag. Years of growing up with Father's stories of Starfleet and his expectations, and I just assumed that this was what I wanted. But it's not. I was overwhelmed by the studies, the demands, the life and death high-risk gambles involved with being in Starfleet. I mean, come on, Worf. You saw how I was getting. You saw how I was struggling. I kept waiting for you to say something, but you didn't. Worf gestured helplessly.
I thought you were faking it, acting as if you were having a difficult time in order to make me feel better about myself, so I would not feel inferior to you.
At that, Simon laughed. He got up, walked across the room, and faced his brother. You have no reason to feel inferior to anybody, ever. You understand that? And you're going to stay here, and going to succeed. You're going to have an incredible career, Worf. You understand me? Worf nodded. I'm going to hug you, Simon announced.
Worf sighed. I was afraid of that.
Simon threw his arms around his brother and hugged him very briefly. He didn't want to push Worf's tolerance further than necessary. He stepped back and said, Make us proud.
Do you have any doubt that I will?
Asked Worf. Simon picked up his bag, walked to the door, and turned to face Worf. None, he replied, and then he was gone. Zach Keebron was lying on his bunk reading when Worf walked in. He stepped carefully so as not to tread on the other side of the room and flopped down in his favorite study chair.
"You know,"
said Worf,
"now that Simon is gone, McHenry could use a roommate. Perhaps if we spoke to Admiral Fincher."
"We could convince her to separate us, put one of us in with McHenry, and end this mutual punishment." Worf nodded. Zach didn't say anything for a time. "Humans don't understand us," he said finally.
"I agree,"
said Worf. "For example," continued Zach, "a human might think that your attempt to save my life when we thought we were on the exploding space station, a human, mind you, might think that your actions would make me think better of you, would make me think that you were capable and trustworthy and loyal to the idea of Starfleet above all else."
"True,"
said Worf gravely.
"but humans would not understand the famous Brakarian stubbornness."
"Equal only," Zach observed, "to the notorious Klingon stubbornness."
"We agree again,"
said Worf. They were silent once more for a time. "There's no point going to Fincher," Zach said at last. "She just insists we should stay together in the vain human hope that we'd grow to respect and maybe even, heaven forbid, like each other."
"Ridiculous."
"Absurd."
"Ludicrous. Still, you are most likely correct. It would appear that we are stuck with each other."
"Indeed." Worf picked up his pad and began to study the next day's lessons. Then he glanced over at the enforced border that ran down the middle of the room.
"You know," he said slowly, "that line is very unsightly."
Zach barely afforded it a glance. "Oh, that thing. I'd all but forgotten it was there. Get it cleaned off the floor, would you?"
"Why me?"
"You found it unsightly."
"Yes, but you put it there."
"Oh, whatever," said Zach impatiently. "We'll discuss it later, when we have less important things to do."
"Right,"
said Worf. Zach looked at him. "You always have to have the last word, don't you?" Worf looked back.
"Yes."
Zach Keebron made a noise that sounded very much like a Bricard equivalent of a snicker, and then went back to his reading.